A city of fewer than 300,000 people once stood between the entire Persian Empire and the annihilation of Western civilization as we know it. No backup, no allies arriving in time, just a small Greek polis, an idea, and the audacity to believe that free men fight harder than slaves. They won, and what happened next changed every single thing about the world you live in today. Your government, your art, your science, your philosophy, the very way you think. All of it traces back to one city built on a rocky hill in southern Greece. This is the entire history of Athens. Athens is not just an old city. It is the oldest continuously inhabited city in the Western world. Over 5,000 years of unbroken human presence on the same ground. Empires rose and collapsed around it. Conquerors came and went. Plagues, fires, wars, occupations. Athens absorbed them all. But here's the question that historians have debated for centuries, and the one we will answer by the end of this video. Was Athens truly the birthplace of democracy, or was it something far more complicated, far more contradictory, and in some ways far darker than the mythology we've been taught? Because the same city that gave the world freedom of thought also enslaved tens of thousands of people to build it. The same men who invented democracy voted to execute their greatest philosopher. The same culture that celebrated beauty and reason also celebrated brutal, ritualized violence. Athens is not a simple story. It is the most human story ever told. Let's go back to the very beginning. Long before the Parthenon, long before Socrates, long before anyone had even coined the word democracy, people were already living on the slopes of the Acropolis, that massive limestone rock that juts 150 meters above the Attic plain. Archaeological evidence tells us that humans settled this area as far back as 3000 BC, during the early Bronze Age. The rock was a natural fortress, fresh water below, defensible cliffs on every side, surrounded by fertile land reaching all the way to the sea. For early humans, this was as close to a perfect location as the ancient world could offer. By around 1400 BC, the area had grown into a significant Mycenaean palace complex, part of the same Bronze Age civilization that produced the legends of Troy and Agamemnon. These were sophisticated palace-driven societies with writing systems, trade networks, and military hierarchies. Athens was already a player. Then, around 1200 BC, something catastrophic happened across the entire eastern Mediterranean. Scholars call it the Bronze Age collapse, one of history's most mysterious and total civilizational breakdowns. Mycenaean Greece, the Hittite Empire, Egypt's New Kingdom, all of them went into freefall within decades of each other. Cities were burned, trade routes vanished, writing was forgotten. Athens remarkably survived. Diminished, yes. Struggling, absolutely. But it never fully went dark. That survival planted a seed. While the rest of Greece stumbled through what historians call the Greek Dark Ages, Athens slowly rebuilt. By around 900 to 800 BC, the population was recovering. Villages were consolidating. A new Greek identity, one that would become the foundation of classical civilization, was beginning to crystallize around this ancient rock. Something extraordinary was being born. But before it could become the Athens of legend, it first had to survive its own internal crisis, a crisis that nearly tore it apart before the world ever got to hear its name. By the 8th century BC, Athens was governed the way most of the ancient world was governed, by whoever had the most land, the most weapons, and the most family connections. A small circle of aristocratic clans called the Eupatridae, literally those born of good fathers, controlled everything. The courts, the harvests, the debt system, the gods, and the debt system was the cruelest part. Poor farmers who fell into debt could be enslaved, not by foreign conquerors, but by their own fellow Athenians. Families were broken apart. Men who had farmed the same land for generations suddenly found themselves the legal property of someone who lived 2 miles away. By the 7th century, Athens was boiling. In 621 BC, a man named Draco was appointed to codify Athenian law for the first time. The result was so brutal that we still use his name as an adjective: draconian. Almost every offense, including stealing a cabbage, was punishable by death. Ancient sources report that Draco himself, when asked why he prescribed death for so many crimes, responded that small crimes deserved death, and he couldn't think of a harsher punishment for the greater ones. His laws were said to be written not in ink, but in blood. It didn't work. The tension only grew. Then came Solon. In 594 BC, The Athenians gave a poet, merchant, and statesman named Solon extraordinary powers to reform the entire system. What he did over the following years was nothing short of revolutionary. He cancelled all debt slavery. He freed those already enslaved for debt. He restructured the class system so that political power was tied to wealth rather than birth alone. Still unfair, yes, but a massive shift from pure aristocratic bloodline control. He also created a new council, the Boule, and expanded the rights of ordinary citizens in the assembly. Solon didn't create democracy, but he built the runway it would one day take off from. And here's the fascinating detail historians point to. Solon reportedly left Athens immediately after his reforms, traveling abroad for 10 years, specifically so that no one could pressure him to undo what he had built. He understood that the system needed time to take root without its author hovering over it. It would still be decades before the real earthquake hit, and when it did, it would come from the most unlikely source, a tyrant. The word tyrant in ancient Greece didn't automatically mean what it means today. A tyrannos was simply someone who seized power outside the normal constitutional framework. Some were cruel. Some, surprisingly, were beloved. Pisistratos was the latter, mostly. He seized power in Athens 3 times between 561 and 5146 BC, and when he finally consolidated his rule, he governed with a kind of populist pragmatism that the poor farmers of Attica genuinely appreciated. He kept Solon's laws in place. He sponsored massive building projects. He promoted festivals that gave ordinary Athenians a sense of shared civic identity. Under his rule, Athens began to feel for the first time like a unified city-state rather than a collection of rival factions. But his sons Hippias and Hipparchus were a different story. In 514 BC, 2 men, Harmodius and Aristogeiton, assassinated Hipparchus in the middle of the Panathenaic festival. It was actually a personal grudge that drove them, not political idealism. But Athens turned them into heroes of freedom anyway. Their statues became the first public monuments in the Western world, erected to honor individuals rather than gods. After the tyranny finally fell in 510 BC with Spartan help, Athens had a choice: slide back into aristocratic infighting or try something genuinely new. A man named Cleisthenes made the choice for them. In 508 to 507 BC, Cleisthenes introduced reforms so radical that Athenians themselves called what he created isonomia, equality before the law. He reorganized the entire citizen body into new tribal units that cut across old geographic and family loyalties. He expanded the assembly's power dramatically. Every male citizen, not just the wealthy, could now speak and vote on the laws that governed them. This was it. This was the moment. Democracy, democracia, rule by the people, was born. Not cleanly, not perfectly, not for everyone, but it was born, and the world would never be the same. Democracy had barely had time to breathe when the largest empire on earth came to crush it. In 490 BC, a Persian force landed at Marathon, about 40 kilometers from Athens. The numbers were overwhelming. The Athenians, aided only by a small contingent from Plataea, faced them with no cavalry, no archers, and no Spartan reinforcements who were delayed by a religious festival. They charged at a run across open ground, straight into the Persian lines. Military historians still analyze what happened next. The Athenians folded their center deliberately, drawing the Persians in, while their stronger wings crushed the flanks and then turned inward. The Persian force, surprised, encircled, and broken, fled back to their ships. Around 6,400 Persians died. The Athenians lost 192. The legend says a runner sprinted the 40 kilometers back to Athens to deliver the news, gasped the single word, victory, and dropped dead. That run is why we have the marathon today. But the Persians came back. 10 years later, under Xerxes, they came back with an army so massive that ancient sources claimed it drank rivers dry as it marched. They burned Athens to the ground. They destroyed the temples on the Acropolis. They scattered the population. And then, the Athenian navy at the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC lured the Persian fleet into a narrow strait and destroyed it. The Athenian statesman Themistocles had correctly gambled that Athens' future lay not on land, but at sea, and he was right. The Persians retreated. Athens stood. What followed was the most extraordinary cultural explosion in human history. With the Persian threat receding, Athens, now the undisputed leader of a Greek alliance and flush with tribute money, poured its energy and wealth into something unprecedented. The Parthenon, built between 447 and 432 BC, still considered by architects 2,500 years later to be among the most perfectly proportioned buildings ever constructed. It was built without a single straight line, every column subtly curved, every surface slightly adjusted, because the architects understood that perfectly straight lines look bent to the human eye. The entire structure was an optical illusion designed to appear more perfect than perfection. This was the Athens of Pericles, the great democratic statesman who would define the city's golden age. This was the Athens of Sophocles and Aeschylus, who invented dramatic theatre, of Herodotus, who invented the writing of history, of Socrates, who wandered the streets asking questions that no one had ever thought to ask. But underneath all of this brilliance, something deeply troubling was being funded, built, and perpetuated, something that historians now argue cannot be separated from the Golden Age itself. Here is the fact that fundamentally reframes everything. At the height of Athenian democracy, between 1/3 and 1/2 of the total population of Attica were enslaved people. Some estimates put the number of enslaved individuals at between 80,000 and 100,000, in a total population of roughly 250,000 to 300,000. The silver mines at Laurion, which funded the fleet that defeated Persia, which funded the Parthenon, which bankrolled the entire Golden Age, were worked by enslaved laborers in conditions that ancient sources themselves described as hellish. Tunnels so narrow workers crawled through them. No ventilation. Toxic air. People worked to death underground. Historians like Orlando Patterson and Moses Finley have argued that ancient Greek freedom and ancient Greek slavery were not opposites. They were inseparable. The concept of freedom was so precious to Athenians precisely because they lived in a world where the alternative, slavery, was immediate, visible, and omnipresent. Free men defined themselves against the enslaved. Citizenship meant something because non-citizenship meant everything could be taken from you. And women, half the free population, had no political rights whatsoever. They could not vote, speak in the assembly, or own property independently. The democracy that the Western world celebrates as its foundation explicitly excluded women, slaves, and foreigners from its definition of the people. This is not a reason to dismiss Athens. It is a reason to understand it fully, because the tension between Athens's ideals and Athens's reality is not a historical footnote. It is the central drama of Athens, and in many ways the central drama of democracy itself, still unresolved today. Now, back to the story, because Athens was about to make its most catastrophic mistake. In 431 BC, Athens went to war with Sparta. The Peloponnesian War would last 27 years, and end with the complete destruction of Athenian power. In the second year of the war, a plague struck Athens. Pericles himself died. Perhaps 1/4 to 1/3 of the entire Athenian population perished within a few years. The historian Thucydides, who survived it, wrote a description of the epidemic so clinically precise that modern epidemiologists have studied it to try to identify what disease it actually was. Athens kept fighting. And then in 415 BC, it made the decision that sealed its fate, the Sicilian expedition. Athens sent the largest fleet it had ever assembled, 200 ships, 5,000 soldiers, to conquer Sicily, for reasons that historians still debate. Was it strategic genius? Was it imperial overreach? Was it collective madness fueled by war fever? It was catastrophe. The entire expedition was annihilated, ships destroyed, army captured. Men worked to death in Sicilian quarries. It was, as Thucydides described it, the greatest destruction ever suffered by any Greek force. Athens never recovered its former strength. In 404 BC, starved out by Sparta's Spartan fleet, which was ironically funded by Persian gold, Athens surrendered. Its famous long walls were torn down to the sound of flutes. Its empire was dissolved. And then, in the poisoned, humiliated atmosphere of post-war Athens, the city made its most famous and most damning decision. In 399 BC, a 70-year-old philosopher named Socrates was put on trial. The charges: impiety and corrupting the youth. The real reason: he had spent decades publicly questioning the assumptions of Athenian leaders, exposing their ignorance, making powerful people look foolish in front of crowds. 501 citizens voted. By a margin of roughly 280 to 220, they condemned him to death. Socrates drank hemlock and died. His student Plato, who witnessed it, spent the rest of his life trying to answer the question that haunted him. How could the most sophisticated democracy in the world vote to kill its wisest man? His answer was deeply pessimistic about democracy itself, and it echoes in every political science classroom on Earth today. Athens never returned to its former imperial glory, but it found a new kind of power, the power of the mind. In 338 BC, Philip II of Macedon defeated Athens and its allies at the Battle of Chaeronea. His son Alexander, tutored famously by Aristotle, who had himself studied at Plato's academy in Athens, would go on to conquer the known world. But he did so carrying Greek culture with him. Athenian philosophy, art, and language became the intellectual currency of a civilization stretching from Egypt to India. Athens, conquered, became the university of the world. Romans who wanted to be educated sent their sons to Athens to study. Cicero studied there. Julius Caesar visited. The city's physical infrastructure was expanded and beautified by Roman emperors who wanted to be associated with Athenian prestige. Aristotle's school, the Lyceum; Plato's academy; the Stoics in the Stoa; the Epicureans in their garden. Athens became a place where every major school of philosophical thought competed in the open air of its markets and colonnades. This period, the Hellenistic and Roman eras, produced something remarkable. Athens lost its political independence, but became the intellectual capital of the ancient world. Its ideas traveled further and lasted longer than its armies ever could have. Now, let's answer the question we asked at the very beginning. Was Athens truly the birthplace of democracy, or was it something far more complicated? Both. It was both, and that is precisely what makes it matter. Athens gave the world the first political system in recorded history where ordinary citizens, not kings, not priests, not hereditary nobles, had the legal right to participate directly in their own governance, to speak, to vote, to hold their leaders accountable. The Athenian assembly at its peak was debating complex issues of foreign policy, taxation, and civil rights with a level of civic participation that most modern democracies struggle to match. At the same time, that system was built on exclusion, on exploitation, on the labor and the suffering of people who were never invited to the table. And here is the insight that changes everything. This contradiction is not a reason to discard Athens's legacy. It is the most important lesson Athens offers us, because every democracy that has ever existed has carried within it the same tension between its stated ideals and its actual practice, between who is included in the people and who is quietly left out. Athens did not invent this problem. Athens made it visible. Athens named it. And Athens, in putting Socrates on trial, showed us exactly what happens when a democracy turns on the very questioning that keeps it alive. The history of Athens is not the history of a perfect civilization that fell. It is the history of humanity's first great experiment with self-governance. Messy, brilliant, cruel, inspiring, contradictory, and profoundly unfinished. That experiment is still running. Today, the Acropolis still stands above modern Athens, a city of 4 million people, still carrying the weight of 5,000 years of history. Tourists photograph the Parthenon and see a ruin, but what they're actually standing in front of is a question. The same question Athens asked 2,500 years ago and never fully answered. What does it mean for a people to govern themselves? Who counts as the people? What do we do when freedom requires asking uncomfortable questions, especially about ourselves? Socrates was killed for asking those questions, but his questions survived. They survived the plague, the Peloponnesian War, the Macedonian conquest, the Roman occupation, the Byzantine era, the Ottoman Empire, Nazi occupation during World War II, and a military junta in the 20th century. The questions always survive. That is the real legacy of Athens. Not the marble, not the mythology, the questions. And as long as those questions are being asked, in courtrooms, in classrooms, in parliaments, in protests, Athens has never truly fallen. If you enjoyed the video, I invite you to click on the video that is currently appearing on your screen and subscribe to the channel. Until next time.